Hey guys, how's it going? In the words of the Cali effect, it's another phenomenal day for Yu-Gi-Oh! What I mean by that is that, as I'm sure a lot of you are probably aware, last week Konami released, or I guess the week before that they released it, but the ban list officially came into effect last week, and on this new ban list they finally decided to murder tiers. And usually I'm not a huge fan of like the Konami ban list, depending on kind of how they decide to go with it, but I'm actually really excited about this one because they killed a tier 0 deck, which I think is phenomenal because I was getting really tired of tier format. Well, I guess they didn't kill it. It's still definitely a playable deck, but it definitely is way more nerfed than I think what it even should have been like on release. That deck is probably one of the strongest decks that Konami's probably ever released. Just due to the fact that so many cards and archetypes and engines want to play out of the graveyard anyway, so the fact that it mills half your deck and also like half your opponents like turn one is pretty wild to me. So they got rid of that. They also got rid of some pretty annoying floodgates. One in Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds, which should have probably died like a very long time ago, to be honest. There's so many decks that just turbo out that card, and it's so frustrating to deal with. Sometimes you just have to like look at your hand, look at the board, and be like, well, that's a nice Barrier Statue. Let's go to game 2. And, you know, that's all you can do about it, which is incredibly frustrating. Not to mention they finally banned Artifact Scythe, which is kind of like way overdue, but you know, whatever. I guess they finally came around to it. At least now you can't like Scythe lock your opponent in these like random like BS decks that just like turbo it out basically, which is kind of cool. Some things I want to go over in today's video are, is Yu-Gi-Oh fun again? So we just came out of a meta where tier was like the best deck, where a lot of players decided this isn't a fun format, it's a tier 0 format with a deck that's basically unbeatable unless you draw like crazy insane to stop them from building their board on your turn. But now we're going into a meta where we have a deck that just straight up tells you can't play the game. So at least, I don't know, kind of pick your poison. At least Kashtira is kind of honest in that way. But the cool thing about playing against Kashtira is that there's actually a lot of ways that you can out their board, and they actually have to play around very specific things for you to not be able to do that. So for example, they recently started adapting the Ibli lock so that way you can't get nibbed. They also have ways to play on other cards like Lava Golem and stuff like that by simply only summoning one monster and maybe setting a couple back row, like one of them being Kashtira Big Bang or something like that. That way they may not lock your zones, but they play around like some weird techs like Lava Golem or Sphere Mode, things like that. If you haven't seen the coverage on YCS Vegas, there was I think it was the finals duel one of the players actually locked out 5 of the spell and trap card zones with a branded player, which means that they couldn't play the game at all really, aside from maybe like normal summon Albaz and like try to super poly their board. But like I think the Macrocosmos guy, the Arise Heart, already had like 3 bit material anyway, so there's no way he was getting to get to do that anyway. I also want to talk about some other techs that we have for the new upcoming format as well, for cards maybe people haven't been considering, or maybe cards that people have been considering, but maybe some ways that you can use them in like different types of decks. I have a couple nice little spicy techs for branded specifically that I'll leave towards like the middle, towards the end of the video, so keep an eye out for that one. And as always, if you do find the content enjoyable or helpful, please do subscribe or like the video. It helps a lot with sharing with other people and getting these more known and helping out with just the YouTube algorithm in general. Granted, a few of these are going to be texts that are like already like well known, for example, like Book of Eclipse, things like that. But I want to kind of emphasize like what types of decks that can use these types of strategies and where they kind of fit best. So the first one I'll talk about is the one I just mentioned, Book of Eclipse. Obviously, this has been one of the most forewarned card to like, you know, pick up before it becomes expensive, etc., because of how good it is against the cash matchup. That being that one, the Shangri-La thing protects itself from card effects. So even from being destroyed by card effects. So even if you have like Raigeki or something like that, it's still gonna protect itself. And that's the only time it ever like detaches material. So like you'd have to do it 3 times to be able to get it off the board. And its effect only applies while it's still face up on the field. And so Book of Eclipse actually books that and the Macrocosmos, which then allows you to play. The main thing I really like about Book of Eclipse is that it also shuts off some of their back row that would actually really annoy you. For example, Big Bang, Kashtira Big Bang. It's basically like an evenly match but for monsters, but they have to control a Kashtira monster. Same thing with Kashtira Birth. They banish some cards out of your graveyard if you activate a spell, which a lot of decks like to do. However, if they have to control a Kashtira monster to do so, a lot of these cards, like for example Tearlament Scream, etc., need those types of cards to be on the field in order for them to activate and resolve. The big problem with Book of Eclipse is that it's ashable, because your opponent may be able to draw cards at the end of the turn on the resolution of the effect. However, the other big problem too is that like if your deck doesn't really get rid of like a lot of big bodies very easily, or big monsters, etc., it's really hard for you to, it's really bad because you could actually end up giving your opponent cards at the end of the turn. This is really good in decks like Dinos, where they don't really care because they're going to OTK you anyway through those face down monsters, especially through like Pentatag, etc. So if you Book of Eclipse them and then they don't Ash it, and you go full combo, UCT is going to absolutely destroy them under Pentastag. Plus, so you don't really care about any of the side effects, or you could just send them all with UCT, and it's very easy to find ways to UCT. Decks where this is actually really bad is like a deck like Sky Strikers, who already has a problem with dealing with face down monsters as it is, because all their cards target and they're usually face up monsters that they target. Not to mention they don't have any like big monsters to kind of be able to beat over like a lot of these cards, and so it's really frustrating to try to deal with like face down cards. So because of that, it's really not worth using Book of Eclipse in a deck like that. One alternative you could do that a lot of people I think aren't really looking at right now is a Book of Lunar Eclipse. This card is probably one you have lying around because it's just the release in the past Megatins as a super. So if you bought any of the Megatins, you probably have a couple of them lying around. While it is not as effective because one, you have to discard a card, which under the Macrocosmos means that card's going to get banished, which may or may not be a plus for you depending on what deck you're playing. Two, it has to target 2 monsters and book them both. So if your opponent only sets up 1 monster, like for example the Macrocosmos trying to play around Lava Golem, Book of Lunar Eclipse becomes pointless. However, also it is kind of annoying if they have like 3 monsters, like for example, if they go full combo and they have the Macrocosmos, Shangri-La is going to summon another Kashtira on the standby phase, which means that they're going to have 3 monsters, which means you still have to deal with some of the back row because they're not all going to be booked. Next up is the big boy himself, Big Bad Nibiru. He's finally back in the format. He's actually pretty useful in against a lot of different decks, mainly Kashtira, because they don't really set up a negate unless they're running the adventure package. But don't forget, he's also good against a lot of other decks. So for example, Sword Soul, they don't always play around it. Well, they probably will now because it's in the format, but also they can't always play around it. They have to like hard draw Long Yuan, which can be a problem sometimes. So sometimes they'll have to use the Shishao to get into Long Yuan. So overall, good card. Some decks might main deck it, some decks might side deck it. I'm personally side decking it for me, but if I was running something like Sky Strikers, I might main deck it just because it helps clear out a lot of other big boards that might be hard to deal with. The only thing that sucks is that you want to be careful about using both Nib and Evenly Matched, because obviously they kind of counteract each other. Brings me to the next card, Evenly Matched. The cool thing about Evenly Matched is that it is getting a reprint pretty soon, I believe, in the Trap Tricks structure deck, so the price should go down. It should be pretty cheap. I think it's a super. It should be pretty easy to get. You could just like buy 3 structure decks and have 3 evenly, which is pretty much by itself worth it. The only downside to Evenly Match is, though, again, the Ibly lock. If they put the Ibly on your field, you can no longer evenly matched, unless you can get rid of that Ibly, which then becomes a kind of a big problem. One cool thing, though, is that one workaround around that is to actually run Econ. So Econ has been kind of rising in popularity recently, and I think for good reason. Number one, being able to tribute the Ibly to then take one of their monsters is really powerful, especially if your deck can run Zeus, which I do recommend running 2 of in the extra deck if you are running, because Zeus, they will banish it out of your extra deck if you're only running 1. Also, if the only downside to it is that it does target. So if you target the Macrocosmos, they're probably just going to banish their own Macrocosmos, because they don't want you to take it and start getting advantage off it, and also get a Zeus off of it potentially. So for that reason, they're probably going to banish it, which means that you kind of wasted 1 card, but not really, because you kind of traded almost like a 2-for-1 in a way, depending, especially if your deck can't really like link off the Ibly by itself. So that's kind of nice. Econ can pretty much be run in just about every deck, with the only caveats being that obviously you kind of want to run it more or less like branded and stuff like that. Decks that can't really deal with Ibly all that well, because it gets rid of the Ibly. Under Macrocosmos, you can't send anything off Forbidden Droplets because it is a cost, so you can't really run that anymore. Also, Econ's just really good in general to just steal other people's monsters and stuff like that, and trying to stop them like mid-combo, or even if you're playing like a mirror match with a deck, like for example, if you're playing mirror match branded, you could steal somebody else's Mirror Jade. However, that brings me into my next card, being Triple Tactics Talents. The reason why I bring this up is because it does steal a monster, but it doesn't target. That's really useful because Kashtira is almost always going to be using a monster during your main phase, because the Kashtira Arise Heart effect to reattach from the banish is a mandatory effect. It happens every time a card is banished, which, since it is a Macrocosmos, will happen anytime a card is like gone to the graveyard after it's been activated or whatever. You could even get the talent off of something like Thrust, because it's always going to be live that way against Kashtira, because the Macrocosmos is forced to reattach anytime anything's banished. So for example, you go Talents effect during the main phase, because obviously during the standby they're going to use Shangri-La to special a Kashtira from the deck, which means they've activated a monster effect during the turn. Thrust does not say during the main phase, just says during the turn. So you go Thrust, add the talents. Now that Thrust has resolved, it gets banished. Macrocosmos attaches whatever, Now that's activated during the main phase, and now Talents is live. So you go Talents activate to take one of their monsters. They don't know which one you're going to take, or even if they do, it doesn't really matter, because if they banish one of them with the Macrocosmos, then you got to take the other one. And if you're running Zeus, you just switch it to attack mode or whatever, hit into something or whatever, it doesn't really matter. You go overlay into Zeus, and then you got to wipe their board, which is perfect because that plays around Big Bang as well. So the Thrust and Talents combo is really good for decks that have really strong searchable normal spells and traps, such as Branded, if you wanted to do that route, because you can always search Branded Fusion if you already have the Talents, or vice versa. Something like Sky Strikers would be really good too, because the sooner you can turn off the Macrocosmos, the sooner you can get your spells engraved. One cool little tech I've been seeing in Branded is the one I was talking about, the kind of a spicy one that I think is kind of nice. I've been seeing people using Fusion Deployment, which I am running currently in my Branded deck as well. I'll put up a list pretty soon once I figure out a good, strong, solid list for it that I think is not too bricky. Fusion Deployment is really useful because you can turbo out stuff like Fallen of Albaz or Cartesia. One thing I thought of a little while ago that I haven't got the chance to put into practice yet was using it to Fusion Deploy out Aqua Dolphin, which apparently someone else thought of the same thing during the 3v3 YCS in Vegas. And they were actually main deck, or I think they were side decking the Aqua Dolphin and the Aqua Neos Fusion. However, that card's been going up in value, obviously, because everybody's been buying it, because everybody saw that. However, one kind of nice little tech is that that's not the only fusion monster that lists Aqua Dolphin in its name. There's actually also a card called Elemental Hero Storm Neos, which also lists Aqua Dolphin and Air Hummingbird. That's important because you can also side an Air Hummingbird game 3 if you're worried about your Branded Fusion not resolving and not being able to get to Masquerade. Then you can actually Fusion Deploy out the Air Hummingbird, which then if they see it coming, that means they have to burn the Ash there, which means your Branded Fusion's free. If they don't, you summon the Air Hummingbird. It gains you life points like per card in their hand, or like decreases theirs. I forget exactly how it works. I know it's a really good time card though, because it does at least like 2,000 damage, or it gives you 2,000 life or whatever. I forget exactly what it does, but it's a good time card, and you can use both of them off the same fusion. So the Storm Neos kind of does the same thing. It's quite a bit cheaper than the Aqua Neos, I believe. I think it's a couple bucks cheaper. It has like multiple printings as well, so it's a pretty good card to use. Plus, you can use it for dual purposes. Also, you have Kaijus that you can use. So not only with like Lava Golem and Sphere mode, those are obviously the ones that are the ones being used the most around right now, which you can use it to clear multiple bodies at the same time. However, the biggest problem is that like decks that require the normal summon, that's not always possible. So for example, Despia kind of needs its normal summon in Aluber. Obviously, you have ways around that with like Branded Opening. However, you'd have to then hope that you hit Branded Opening and the Sphere mode or whatever. Or, you're probably running Lava Golem if you're gonna do it, and which is kind of like not very likely, even if you're running Prosperity. And so for decks that require the normal summon, you could probably want to use something like Kaijus. Kaijus are pretty good because they're very directed, like basically problem solvers. So you can either get rid of the Macrocosmos or the Shangri-La. Not only that, but your opponent, you can only lock your zones, whereas the Kaijus summon to your opponent's field. So you don't have to worry about like things like, for example, people were saying that Kurikara is not so good right now because if they lock all your zones, then you can't summon Kurikara anyway, which is true. So these cards that actually summon to your opponent's field can actually be very beneficial. The last few cards are some pretty powerful traps, being Imperm, D-Barrier, things like that. Things that you can even set off a Thrust if you wanted to like main deck Thrust and just like keep these cards main decked if you have the space for it. It's really good in a deck like Labyrinth. Labyrinth can turbo out a lot of like normal traps really easily. So having stuff like the D-Barrier is really good against decks like Branded, against decks like Cash, because you just call Xyz, they're kind of screwed. Against decks like what you call it, Sword Soul, where they only do synchro summoning mostly. So against those decks, it's really powerful. One card I've been kind of thinking about is Heavenly Zephyr Miradora. When your opponent special summons a monster from the extra deck, you can special summon him. You target one of those monsters, and those monsters' effects cannot be activated while he's on the field. So the fact that you can't even activate the Shangri-La means that they can't bring out the Arise Heart to have the Macrocosmos start banishing your stuff. Also, the Miradora effect cannot be negated. Even if there was something else that could counter that, like for example the Griffin, the Adventure Griffin, then it doesn't matter because you can't negate it. The cool thing is too is that it is a dragon, so you can actually search it off Magnamut, which means that if you're going first, you can actually like go through your combo, go Magnamut effect, banish the Mercurier if you're playing Despia, and you summon it, activate effect to search during end phase, you search the Miradora, now you have it ready for their turn. Like, I don't think that like Miradora and Book of like Lunar Eclipse are the best options necessarily, but they're kind of interesting options you might be able to tech in certain decks, maybe like Dragon Link, etc., for things like that. Another card that's kind of an honorable mention right now is Crossout, especially in decks like Despia, because you can actually like run Ash yourself or run Nib, etc. You can actually cross out those targets when they try to use it against you. Also, you can tech in 1D barrier like games, game 2 or whatever if you're going second. That's gonna be pretty much it. I just want to talk about some of the advances in the meta over the past couple months. I personally am really happy about the new changes in the meta because I got really tired of the old stale tier format. The deck was okay, it was cool, I guess, whatever, but not to mention it was very restrictive on what decks you could run in the format. I think this format opens up a lot as far as like diversity. But if you feel like this format's way worse than the last one just because it locks your zones, etc., whatever, please feel free to leave it down in the comments. I'm curious on your guys' thoughts on if you like this meta now or prefer the previous one. I know we're kind of still in the start, but it looks to me like it's kind of shaping up to be a much better meta going forward, and I'm tired of dealing with Chain Link 12 with tier limits. As always, if you found the content to be really helpful, please like and subscribe. Don't forget to leave comments, etc. to help out with the YouTube algorithm. That's pretty much it. I'll catch you guys later.